right. Well, it is an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. I'm very grateful for being invited to do this. And just as a beginning here, please forgive me if I'm a little distracted. So the girls made cookies with my wife this morning. And so needless to say, cookies have been on their minds. So when I was reviewing my notes today, they were sitting on my lap drawing cookies. So if I get distracted, that's where my mind is gone. So tonight I'm going to be talking about things we want to say and not say to our children. I think the gospel reading that we had just before we got started here is an absolute, kind of wonderful introduction into this. So we're going to talk about things that you should not be saying to your children, that you should not be sending as a message to your children, but also alternative ways to handle that, right? So things I should be saying to my children and fostering with them. And then after that, at the very end, we're going to actually talk about 5 things we do want to say to our children. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the first one in relation to things that we should not be saying to our children. So that first thing is because your mother or father and I said so. Okay, now this is a pretty common one, pretty popular one all at the same time. Now, this is at best effective until the age of reason, right? And probably not even that long. Your children are going to be asking why, right? Why? Why do I have to do this thing? Because mom and dad said so isn't really good enough of a reason anymore. And so what's important here is that it's our job to explain to our children why something is right or wrong, why it's appropriate or inappropriate, because this ultimately provides them with a foundation upon which to build their conscience. Okay, and so if they're just hearing all the time, mom and dad said no, they have nothing to build upon, right? And it's our duty as parents, first and foremost, to be the educators of our children, and most especially their conscience. It also allows us to kind of have a hands-on approach and to show them what appropriate behavior looks like in any given situation. Okay, so, St. Thomas actually speaks about this. He talks about one of the duties that we have, right, is teaching our children virtue. And he says that virtue, one of the things about it is that it is voluntary. No one can be forced to be virtuous. We can do things that would be considered a virtuous behavior, but there is no growth in that. So if we tell our children, do this because I told you to, we're missing an opportunity to help our children to actually grow into virtue, to teach them to do what is right and good. Okay, because once I say, I told you to do this, go do it, it's no longer voluntary, right? So we want to be able to teach them the behaviors that they should engage in and give them the room and the growth to grow in that so that they can therefore grow in virtue. One of the most important things that we're going to do as parents is when our children are 18 or whatever age it might be and they move outside of the home, our job at that point is to raise them in all the virtues, have all those be intact so that they can go out in the world and be those that love, serve, and fear God, of course. Okay, and so this is something that I can't really emphasize enough. I think one of the things I run into the most is that children can't stand hearing that, right? They don't want to hear from mom and dad, that I have to do this because you told me to. They tend at that point just to think mom and dad don't have a good reason, right? So providing them with that is very important. Now, an alternative strategy that I teach parents in relation to this is what we call virtue prompting. And virtue prompting is just what it sounds like. Okay, so this is providing our children with an opportunity to be virtuous, to voluntarily do so. Okay, so this would be something like, when your children are arguing with one another, saying to them, well, what do you think the generous thing to do in this situation would be? Right? What do you think the loving, the charitable thing to do with your sibling would be at this point in time? Okay, so it gives them the opportunity to voluntarily engage in that behavior. Again, it's not a forced behavior. If I tell them you're going to go apologize to your sibling, there's no virtue in that, right? There's no growth in that because they're being told what to do. But if I can say to you, what's the charitable thing to do? Then they can make the option to go apologize, right? To go say something kind to their sibling. Okay. Now, there is a handout that you have, and this is the one in relation to virtues and age development. And this was actually developed by a psychologist. His name is Dr. Patrick Deviatri. He's been doing Thomistic psychology for about 40 years. He's a very, very brilliant mind. And he put this together based on St. Thomas's writing and the appropriate age at which we start to develop these virtues. Okay, so this is laid out by age group, what it is that you want to start fostering and what you can effectively foster in your children. Okay, so the first one's going to be justice, right? We learn to do what it is that our parents are directing us to do when we are children, right? And it goes to the eldest age group in there is when we start to learn prudence, right? And that's when we start to learn how to make rightly ordered decisions and to do what is good. But there's a development that takes place between justice and prudence for us to be able to effectively do that as we grow. Okay, so I just encourage you guys, when we're done here, I won't spend really any time talking about that. If you do have questions, of course, please just let me know. Father has my contact information. If any of you guys want to contact me, or if you have questions when we're done, please feel free to ask those. But it lays out some of the behaviors, some of the things you actually want to be fostering in your children. Okay. Now, the second thing that we're going to go to here is of things that you do not want to say to your children. Your brother, your sister, your friend is simply better at that than you are. Okay? And that's kind of the explanation for why they're coming up short with something. And all this does is psychologically, it forces them to focus on what they're deficient at, what they're not good at, right? And a lot of children will actually start to hyper-focus on this. And what that does is it takes away from them focusing on the gifts that God has actually blessed them with, right? Each of our children, we all know this, are very unique, right? No two are the same. And God is calling each of them to use those talents that he's blessed them with. And when we do something to cause them to focus simply on what they're deficient at, they no longer start to foster those virtues, right? They no longer start to foster those strengths because they're spending so much time looking at what they're deficient at. It doesn't mean it's not healthy for them to work on those things, but to tell them that this is a short area, right? This is an area where you come short is going to give them the impression that mom and dad need me to focus on this. Otherwise, I'm not living up to par, right? I'm not as good as my brother, not as good as my sister. And that psychologically for them, especially at such a young age, causes a lot of difficulty for them, right? And so each of our children, we believe that they are made in the image and likeness of God, right? And so in some way, each of them manifests some aspect of God's perfection. Okay, our children are not annoyances, right? They're not someone we have to feed or take care of or clothe, right? They in some way show to us God's perfection, his infinite perfection. And these strengths, these skills that he's trying to present to the world through our children, if we're not helping them to foster them, they're being lost, right? They're not excelling. Now, the other thing that it also causes is that our children then feel as if they have to find an identity, right? Now, they have that sense anyway, but God has kind of built that identity into them, right? If they are to focus and foster on these different strengths and virtues that they have, they will grow into that identity organically, naturally. But when they're focusing on what they're not good at, chances are they're going to miss that, right? And then they're going to go searching for an identity. And this is when a lot of us, I think we can all look back at our own experiences. This is when we got ourselves into a lot of trouble, right? We were trying to become independent, find out who it was that we are, and the reality is we had kind of missed who it was that we are, right? We weren't taught to focus on those things, okay? So, helping them to foster the strengths and the virtues that they do have is going to help them to grow into that identity and that person that God desires them to be, right? Now, an alternative strategy to this, and where I would direct parents in relation to this, is what we call vocational discipleship. And vocational discipleship, it usually happens around middle childhood. So let's say 10 to 14 years old. And when this happens, what is happening is the parents are helping the children to discover and grow and show ways that they can serve the family and the wider community. That's what we're helping within that, okay? We're helping them to become disciples of Christ, right? And our job is to walk with them, not simply sit there and criticize them or tell them what they're doing wrong, right? So they want to learn to make meaningful contributions to the world based on the strengths that God has given them. Okay, and it's our job to walk with them. Now, it often takes more effort on our part, right? It's kind of like when your children want to help you, vacuum the living room. Well, we all know that letting them do that with you, it's going to take twice as long and be twice as dirty than if I would have just done it myself, right? But what am I teaching my child in that moment? What am I helping them to develop, right? I'm telling them they're a nuisance, right? I'm telling them I can do this faster. You need to get out of the way, right? And again, this leads to them starting to find or look for their own identity, right? It sets the message that you are being rejected, right? And over time, that's going to grow, and that's going to be fostered if this is something that I continue to do, okay? Now, one of the other things, too, is that I would say here is that, no, not everyone gets a trophy, okay? And please forgive me for that, but that's a very dangerous mentality that we have, right? Because, I mean, ultimately, what we're sending there is this message that everyone has the same talents, everyone is excelling in all the same gifts, and we're pretty much all the same person, right? But again, it takes away from the uniqueness of the child, right? And it keeps them from striving, because why develop anything that I'm good at or not good at when I'm going to get a trophy anyway, right? When I'm going to get a round of applause anyway, right? Now, again, this isn't saying that we don't help our children, right? And we don't cheer them on. Of course we do, right? But again, we want to help them to show forth to the world all those things that God has blessed them with, okay? I usually go back to the parable of the talents in relation to this, right? And the master gives the talents to his servants, right? The 3 servants. Now, talents, obviously, scripturally it was referring to a kind of monetary system. But I'm actually going to apply this more to talents in and of themselves, things that we are able to do. And in that, if you remember how this parable goes, right, one of the servants takes and brings back whatever it was, tenfold, right, profit. And the other one makes a little bit smaller of a profit, and the last one buries them. And when the master comes back and calls for an account, he calls the wicked servant, right, the one who buried them, right, the ones who took them and grew them are the ones that he applauds. And this is the same thing with the talents that our children have, right? They're not to be hidden, they're to be uncovered, right? They're to be shown forth. And it's our job, again, to help them to do that, okay? It's our job to help form them as they grow. Now, the next thing that we should not be saying to our children is, why can't you be more like, and fill in the blank here, right? Your brother, your sister, your friend, whoever it might be. Why can't you be more like them? And what this does is this leads our children to make social comparisons, right? This is when they really start to notice what's different between me and other people. Okay, and I just have a couple statistics here that I just want to point out to kind of show the deleterious effects this has on our emotional state and our self-perception. So just a couple studies here. I won't read the authors. I'll just kind of read what they found. But what they found is that when we spend time on social media comparing ourselves to others, there are a couple effects. So there's an increase in depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Okay, now there's a decrease in our self-esteem, our self-evaluations, and our overall well-being. Okay, so all across the board, this has a very negative effect on us. And so if we're pointing our children to do this, even if we don't have them on social media, we're pointing to them to compare yourself to everybody else, right? Make this comparison. It also subtly sends the message that, quite honestly, you're not good enough as you are, right? I want you to be more like somebody else, okay? And again, this hurts them forming their identity. Now, one of the things that's actually really interesting, and we've actually found studies in relation to this in modern psychology today, is that when somebody learns to think a certain way, right, this changes our disposition, right? And so just as a quick example here, if my wonderful wife was to storm out right now and say, I don't want anything to do with you anymore, well, needless to say, I'd be a little heartbroken, right? And I'd probably leave and cry and, then come back and talk to you guys. And what is happening there is right now my disposition is to sadness, right? So I act well upon sadness. I love sad things. Let's listen to sad music, read sad books, rom-coms, all those fun things, right? But if you guys were to stand up and start applauding, right, I'm probably going to throw something at you, right? Because that is not my disposition. It's opposite of my disposition at that moment. And what this serves to do is actually reinforce the disposition that I have. So if my disposition is to sadness, I'm going to be reinforcing that by wanting to take in things that are sad. And we actually see this in studies. People that are depressed, when they're asked to think about things that are negative, that are sad, they actually get a release of pleasure chemicals in their brain. And this reinforces them doing that, right? Because that feels good. We enjoy those things, right? So even though they're miserable and they recognize that they're miserable, they're receiving this reinforcement that keeps them stuck. Because St. Thomas also says that when I start acting against my disposition, I start acting in an opposite manner. So in my example, I start acting in relation to joy. It's painful. I don't like it. Now, my disposition will eventually shift if I stick with it long enough, but I'm not receiving the reinforcement. I'm not getting those feel-good chemicals released in my brain, right? I'm not experiencing joy. And so chances are I'm going to remain where I was, right? I'm going to remain in that place. And so this is one of the dangers of social media, right? Look at any of those things, the depression, the anxiety, the low self-esteem, the loneliness. These things have the possibility of getting reinforced. And I think we can all kind of look at our own experiences and recognize that this is true, right? We've all had those times we look and we see everybody's perfect life, right, on Facebook, and we look at our own and say, yeah, it's not as good as that, right? And what do we feel in those moments? Well, we kind of feel down on ourselves, I'm not making enough money, I'm not successful enough, my family isn't perfect enough, whatever it might be, right? And if we're doing this day after day, that becomes our disposition pretty quickly. And if we're asking our children to do that, right, when we're saying, why can't you be more like this person? We're growing that, we're fostering them in that, we're teaching them that is how they should look at themselves in comparison to everybody else in the world. But we live in a world where we really don't want to be part of what everybody else is. We really don't want to. We don't want to be pointing our children down that direction, right? We're called to be different. I don't really need to point this out, but, the world's a mess today, right? Thank you, right? Thank you, Captain Obvious. But, our job as parents is to help protect our children from that, right? Not push them faster towards it. Okay, our job is to prepare them. So what is an alternative strategy to this? Well, this is then where I'm going to direct you to that second handout. And this is something I actually use in my professional work with Catholic counselors. And what it is it's called a mission statement. And this is usually one of the first things we do with people. It's pretty direct, straightforward, easy enough to do. The directions are on there for you. But ultimately what you're doing there is you're looking at the strengths that God has given you as an individual, and you're creating a statement to help you to remember who that is, right? So a mission statement, when you're done with it, is going to sound something like, I'm a loving, kind, caring, supportive person who's capable of being patient, charitable, and loving, right? Now, the first part of that, the I am, what we're looking at there is those strengths that God has given me naturally, right? Some of us are more loving, some of us are more patient, right? It's kind of natural to us that we can help our children notice what those things are for them. Now, the I'm capable part of that is that I have these strengths because I've shown them before, right? We've all been patient. Not all the time, but we've all been patient. And God is often calling them to develop those strengths, right? There's some smoothing around the edges that we need to do. And so this mission statement gives us a little bit of a guide forward, right, on who it is that we are and who we're being called to be. So I actually have kind of a fun story. I'm working with this young man, so he's 9 years old now. And unfortunately, he gets bullied at school. And we created this mission statement, and he now keeps a copy of it in his pocket. And he goes to school, and every time he experiences something from these other children, he pulls out his mission statement and he reads it. And what he told me is that it brings me back to who I am, right? It lets me recognize that I'm not what people are telling me that I am. I'm these things. Right? I know these things to be true. Okay, and so you have that handout there because doing this with your children would be a very beautiful thing. And it's something that evolves and changes over time, right? Those strengths that you have as they grow, as they develop them, that list is just going to get bigger and bigger. Eventually, they're going to have to get selective about what they keep in that mission statement because it's going to be too big, right? They're going to be carrying little books around with them all the time. And that's just simply one of those things that would probably give them a backache. So that's kind of the alternative strategy there. And now I'm distracted because I have one of these cookies in front of me. Now, the next thing, the fourth thing here that we should not be saying to our children is this. What and who you feel like is what and who you really are. Just be you and be proud of it. Okay, and one of the things I want to emphasize here so strongly is that our influence on our children is incalculable. Even when we don't feel like they're listening to us, which, let's be honest, is most of the time, right? They are sponges. They are soaking these things in. I can't tell you how many times I have, when I'm working with a child, the parent will talk to me and say, okay, these things are going on, but we think our children have no idea right? And then I'll talk to that son or daughter, and they can tell me more than the parents told me about what's going on, right? They are sponges. They know what's going on. And they are listening to us, right? We're laying the groundwork for the future, though, because we're not necessarily going to get the results or the response now in relation to what we're directing them towards. But that will change over time. Okay, these are things that they will keep with them. And even more important than this is, God has given charge of these souls, these children, to us as parents. We are God's representatives here on earth to those children while they are in our household. And it is our job to raise those souls the way that God desires us to, not for us to decide how it is that we want to shape them. Okay? So I want to throw out some statistics here that I think are very important. Now, the first one here is that there is a Gallup daily tracking survey. And according to this survey, 4.5% of the population identifies as LGBT, and 3.8% of those in Wisconsin. Okay, so numbers-wise, across the nation, that's over 15 million, and in Wisconsin, that's almost 250,000. Okay? And I promise I won't give a soapbox speech here about this. But needless to say that it is not our job to help our children in disorder. Okay? It is not on us to foster them because we have an agenda, because we don't want to stand up and do what is right by them, because we don't want to go against society. Right? We're going to stand before God in relation to all of these things. And we need to take that very seriously. It is our job to help them form their consciences. It is our job to help them understand natural law, which includes the human person, the human body, right? And if they can understand natural law, they'll understand why these things are not right, right? It's using what God has given them in a disordered way. It's using it in a way that it wasn't meant to be. I always steal this example from Patrick Madrid, so some of you might be familiar with this from Relevant Radio. And what he said is when we use things against natural law, against the way God created them to be, it's kind of like I'm trying to hang a painting. And I don't have a hammer, but I do have a cell phone. So I'm going to use my cell phone to nail that nail on the wall. What am I going to end up with? Well, a broken cell phone, right? And maybe the nail goes in, maybe it doesn't. A phone is not meant to be used for that, right? A hammer is, right? Everything has its own proper function and its proper end. That ultimate end is God. And God has determined what the steps are between point A and point B when we get to him. And our job is to help our children understand what that is. Okay, now I know even in Catholic circles, this isn't a popular topic nowadays. And unfortunately, I know many Catholics who look at these things and say, well, I really don't want to say anything against it, right? This is really popular. Who am I to tell my child who they can love, and so on and so forth? Well, if we look at the definition of what love is willing the good of another. Okay, it's not a feeling, it's not an emotion. It's willing their good. And that includes when it puts me out, when I have to suffer in relation to that. And so if I'm going to truly love my children, I have to be willing to suffer for them, which means I stand up for what is right even if they don't like it. Okay, that doesn't mean that people don't suffer with these things, right? It doesn't mean it isn't crosses that they carry. It very much is, right? But for us to tell a child who is anorexic, you know what, you're right, you are fat. You should go on a diet. Am I helping them? Right? No, I'm doing irretractable harm. Right? The same thing here, right? Okay, you have, this attraction to someone of the same sex. I'm just going to confirm you in that. Right? I'm doing the same harm. Right? I'm moving them in a direction of something that is not good for them. Okay? So now 2 other just quick statistics with this. There are now 13 types of sexual orientation, apparently, and 81 gender identities. I don't even know what that means, to be quite honest, right? But needless to say, there's a lot of disorder and a lot of confusion in the world, right? And our job is to protect our children from that. Our job is to prepare our children for that so that they know what is true and good, right? Rather than giving them this spreadsheet and saying, pick one of these 81, you can be whatever you want. Right? Our job is to help them be the people that God is calling them to be. Now, the alternative strategy for this is there was something that was actually developed by two Catholic psychiatrists, and this is kind of the first time Catholicism actually made its way into psychology. And this was done by a Dr. Conrad Bars and Anna Terui. I'm probably not pronouncing her last name correctly, but it's called affirmation therapy. And what this is based on, and they take this from St. Thomas, and what they say is that love is necessary in order for a person to feel good, worthwhile, lovable, and to possess the capacity to share those things with others. Okay, this is necessary. It's innately drawn into us, right? And so this theory ultimately posits that we have this basic need for human love. It is natural to us. And what they posit in this as well is that for us to reach maturity, there is this relationship, a harmonious one, between our mind, our body, our emotions, and our soul under the guidance of reason and our will. Okay. Now, the thing I want to point us to that is so important there is that it's under the guidance of reason and will. And the reason St. Thomas says is that the good of reason is to know what is true. And the good of the will is to do what is good. And if we're not giving those to our children, how are they going to choose either of those? How are they going to know what to do? And how are they going to have the strength to do it? And why I want to point out this affirmation therapy is good is that we should be affirming our children in their inherent goodness, right? Their worth, their potential. We should be fostering this in our interactions with them. But we should do it based on what it is that they do well, what is good about them, that they are inherently made in God's image and likeness, right? And therefore they have infinite worth. So we affirm them in what is good, right? Not in what isn't, okay? Now this is very important for children too. They need to know that they are loved and they are good, right? As they posit there, and they take this from St. Thomas, that we have this innate need to experience love, right? It is very important for the human person. Now, the last thing that we should not be saying to our children is nothing, okay? And too many of us fall prey to this, okay? We don't spend enough time with our children. We don't talk to them enough. And what studies have actually found is that when children are not talked to, especially when they're young and developing, if they are not talked to consistently, almost constantly, not only do their brains not develop, right, the neural connections don't actually grow, but they actually experience brain damage, okay? They need that constant talking. Now, there's also this stereotype, and I know all of you have heard this, that women talk too much, right? It actually is true. Studies show that, but that's not a bad thing, okay? This is a perfection that God gave to women. Okay, they talk 10 times as much as men, and they get 4 times the pleasure in talking, okay? That is for the children, right? That is a perfection that women have. So, ladies, when someone says you talk too much, you just tell them that's because God gave me this perfection, and you need to listen to me, okay? We'll see how that goes, I don't know, but while this might be seen as something that is negative in society, right, this is something that actually God has ordained for the children, right, to help them to develop. So it's not enough for us to be absent parents. Now, I recognize that some parents need mom and dad to be working outside of the home. That is a reality. The economy's not great, hasn't been for a while, right? And so these things are realities, but that doesn't excuse us from when we're home, spending that time with them, right? Denying myself watching TV, sitting on my phone, going and hanging out with friends. My job is to be with my children, right? To talk with them, to share with them, right? To ask them how they are, to find out who they are, right? And that falls on mom and dad. Okay, so husbands, you don't get to just look at your wife and say, you talk 10 times as much as I do, so this is on you now, right? No, absolutely not, right? You have a very influential role. Studies actually show this, and I think this kind of follows the tradition of the church, but, the mother is so formative in the young years. And then as children grow, the role of the father becomes more and more important, right? This isn't a one or the other thing as far as raising a child, right? Both the husband and the father have very, very important roles, okay? Now, an alternative, strategy to this. How do we not fall prey to this, okay? And what it is that we do is we help our children to develop what we call a secure attachment. Okay, and a secure attachment is just on a very simplistic level that our children recognize that we are a safe place to come, that they will get their needs met, not just physically with shelter and food and drink and so on and so forth, but also emotionally, psychologically, right? Their needs will be met, and they know that they can come to mom and dad. They know what they're going to get each time, right? And they can make the choice to do that. Now, the opposite of this is what we call an insecure attachment. And an insecure attachment can look a couple different ways, but one of those is what we call an anxious attachment. And that basically means mom and dad were there for me sometimes. I sometimes got my needs met, but I really didn't know what I was getting. It kind of depended on what mood they were in, right, or what place they were in at that point. And needless to say, this is really difficult. It affects the emotional, mental, and physical development of children. And it could actually lead to difficulties in learning and forming relationships. Right? This has a large influence on how they relate to others, right? And so helping our children to have that secure attachment is going to, again, pay dividends in the long term as well, because they are going to come to us as young adults, as adults, and they're going to listen to our counsel. Doesn't mean they're always going to do what we want. In fact, more often than not, they won't, but they will listen to what we have to say. Okay, but if our relationship with them isn't deep enough as far as planting seeds in soil, if the topic we're trying to talk to them about is deeper than the relationship, you're going to get resistance every time. But if the relationship is as deep or deeper than the topic, they will listen to you. You will be able to plant a seed. Again, it doesn't mean they're going to do what you want them to, but they are willing to listen to your counsel, and they will take it to account because you are someone that they respect. Okay, and that seed will be planted, and who knows what God can do with that down the road. Right, even if we see them making mistakes now or things that we don't desire for them. Okay, so that, again, that alternative strategy is helping them to foster that secure attachment with you as a parent, right, which means I'm present with my children. Now, kind of shifting where we're going a little bit, this first part I was basically telling us why we're all really bad parents, right, and making you feel bad. Now I'm going to turn it around and kind of save myself here a little bit and talk about the things we should be saying to our children, right? The things we should be doing. And many of you are probably doing these things, and if you're not, I just simply encourage you to start doing them. And so the first one is what you say to your children is, I love you without ending, qualifications, restrictions, or limitations, right? There is nothing you need to do to earn my love. Okay, you have inherent worth and goodness as my child, made in the image and likeness of God, that my love will always be here. Doesn't mean I have to agree with everything you do. Inevitably, I'm not going to at some point or another. But you will always be loved regardless of that. Doesn't mean I won't tell you the truth, but I'm going to do it with charity. Right? I'm going to love you, and you never need to worry about that. And what this does is it ultimately allows us to model the love of God to our children. Right? We help them to experience God's love. We keep one barrier from being in the way of them experiencing that love. I refer to counseling as, we all have these barriers that keep us from receiving God's love, at least the fullness of it. And our job in counseling is to rip those barriers away so that that individual can receive that love, right, and empowering them to do that. And this is what we're trying to do for our children, right? We're modeling that love, and we're helping them to receive that love rather than putting barriers in the way that are to keep them from that. Right. Now, the second thing we do want to say to our children, we're doing this, and you fill in the consequence here, because we desire what's best for you. Okay, this is pretty much the exact opposite of, do it because mom and dad said so. We're doing this because we want what's best for you. And this ultimately comes down to, for us, moderation of our tempers, our frustration. When I provide my child with a consequence, the first thing I should be able to ask myself is, am I doing this because this is what is best for them? Or am I doing this because I'm angry, because I'm frustrated, because this is my way of getting them to be quiet, stop doing what they're doing, lashing out, right? Why we're doing these things, there needs to be a reason. And again, if we go back to helping our children be raised and grow in virtue, if we are not telling them and giving them the freedom to make rightly ordered choices, they can't grow in that virtue, right? Because it's not free, and they don't understand why they're doing it in the first place, right? So letting them know that your mother and I, or your father and I, are giving you this consequence because what you did was wrong. And this is what we want you to learn from it, right? This is why we are doing this specific punishment, right? The punishment should be a logical consequence, is kind of how we refer to it. And what that means ultimately is that they should be able to recognize their behavior in the punishment and realize why we want them to be doing that thing. Okay, so it's not, we invited you to dinner while you were playing video games, you didn't come, and so now you're grounded for the next 10 years, right? Well, what's logical about that, right? What the consequence should be based on what they were not showing to the family. That's charity, that's love. They were showing that my video games are more important than my family. And so until you can consistently show your mother and I, your father and I, that you love us more than your video games, the video games will be gone. Right? So you're giving them something to work towards. And how they choose to show you that they love you more than those video games, is where the virtue comes in. Because they get to choose how they're going to do that. Right? You can help them, you can coach them, they can come to you, but you're leaving that up to them. And until they do that, well, they're not getting the video games back. Right? So there needs to be a reason why I'm giving them the punishment that I am. Now, the third one is going to sound a little funny, but bear with me on this one. So it's, let's go on a date together, just you and I. Okay, sounds a little funny, right? But I mean this when I say this, you should be dating your children. And not in some weird way, okay, please know that. But what I mean by that is, as parents, we should be taking each of our children on a date, at least once a month. We should be taking them out Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, and spending the entire day with just them, right? Getting to know them, doing something they enjoy, learning about them, showing that they can have that secure attachment with us, that they can speak up, that they can talk to us, that they can be open and free in those things, that they don't need to hide things from us. Now, that doesn't mean I sit them down and say, you need to tell me everything going on in your life, but I do need to open the door. I do need to let them know that I want to know what's going on in your life because I care about you, right? And they may not take advantage of that right away, and they might not even know how, right? Especially when they're little. They might tell you something like, this is a secret, Dad, but I love chocolate, right? And sometimes I take some from the candy jar, right? And that's okay. I mean, it is what it is. We can laugh about it, right? But ultimately what you're doing is you're helping them to know that that door is open. And so when they have things that they do need to come talk to you about, they can do that. But if I'm not giving them the time and the place, they're not going to be able to do it. And especially in big families, right? This is very difficult. We have all our children running around. We're trying to give them all attention. We're doing a lot of things as a family, and that's a very good thing, and it's essential. But they also need that individual time with you, right? They have to have that. They have to have that individual time with you, or they will never bond with you, right? It'll never develop above and beyond what it is just naturally. Okay, so when I say date your children, that's what I mean by that. Take them out, spend time with them, just mom and the child, just the dad and the child, and let them have that time. It just has to be a couple hours, right? It's something, even though we're all really busy, it's something that we can all afford to do. And it doesn't even need to cost any money. Go to a park, right? Do something that's interesting. Go shoot hoops, go to a bookstore and read some books together. Do whatever you want to, right? But it doesn't even need to cost money, right? And for them, that's not what it's about anyway. They want you and your attention. Right? That's what's important there. So give that to them. Now, one of the other things in relation to that is we actually talk a lot about building rituals. And what we mean by rituals, there are actually 4 different rituals that we talk about. And they are work, play, talk, and pray. Okay, so work, play, talk, and pray. And what these rituals are is they help families to connect on an individual level, but also as a family. And so work rituals, very simply, is when I gave that example earlier of the vacuuming, right? Making a work ritual is that we as a family get together and we make dinner together, or we clean the house together, or we do the laundry together. But instead of just this mentality that we have in society today that everything's divide and conquer, right? We divide and conquer, get the children out of the way, make them be quiet, put them in front of the TV, right? We do these things together, right? We bond, we make it fun, right? We make it enjoyable, okay? It might give you a little pushback at first, especially the older that they are, but if you can make this something enjoyable where you guys can have fun and you can talk and you can do things that are exciting, make cookies like my wife did with our children, right? They love those moments. They love that. And they might just draw cookies on all the paper you have around the house, so that could be kind of cool too. Now, a play ritual. This is exactly what it sounds like. Have fun with your children. This is the one we're usually the best at. But again, it involves me giving them that time, right? I have to devote that time to them. We play a board game, we go out, we watch a movie, we go learn a new hobby, whatever it might be. It's pretty much endless, right? But it's having fun as a family, but also just individually. Talk rituals. We should all be eating dinner around the table together every evening. And this is a perfect place to have those talk rituals. How was your day? How are you? What are your dreams? What are your goals? What's going well in life? What's not? Right? More than just the weather. Right? But again, this is providing another place for them to share. And it's providing another place where siblings can support one another. Right? You should be asking your children, what can I do to make you feel loved today? What can I do to make you feel loved tomorrow? Right? But these conversations should be meaningful. They should be purpose-driven. And then the last ritual is the pray. We need to be praying with our children. The family that prays together does stay together. And I've seen it time and again. One of the first things that I'll have when I'm seeing a husband and a wife and there's something going on within the family, one of the first things I check in with them and have them start doing is, are you praying together? And when the answer is almost inevitably no, the first thing I have them do is start praying together. And you would be amazed at what a difference that makes. Right? Sometimes that's really all they need. Right? But the family isn't connected on such an important level. So you need to be praying, and this comes down to, I'm going to really push this on all the fathers here, the husbands. It is your job to lead the family and to provide for the family. Doesn't just mean I provide money. Doesn't just mean that I support the family in whatever way. I'm leading them in prayer. I'm the one pulling out the rosary. They should see me walking around with a rosary, right? And I'm leading the family in that prayer. It couldn't be any more important, right? And God has given that duty to the father. He needs to be doing that. Doesn't mean mothers, you don't do that, right? Of course. One of the fondest memories I have of my mother and my grandmother is that I almost always saw them with a rosary. And I still do, right? And that's something that's stuck with me, and it will continue. And I hope my children have those same memories of me, right? And my wife as well, okay? Now, the next thing that I want to hit on is the importance of saying, your mother or your father and I love one another very much. Your children need to know that. They need to know that you are solid, that there is going to be a mother and a father in the home, that they don't have to worry about you separating, right? That they know when there's disagreement within the family, that mom and dad are going to help to fix that, right? And they're going to fix the arguments between one another. Okay, now, and I say this not lightly, but even if you are miserable in your marriage, you are to do this for the children. Now, that doesn't mean you don't fix your marriage. You absolutely need to be working on your marriage, and it is work, and it will go for the rest of your life. But that doesn't mean I get to skip out because marriage isn't easy anymore. It doesn't mean I leave, right? The damage it's going to do to you is just out of this world, but the damage it's going to do to your children even more so. Okay? They need to see mom and dad together. They need to see you as a rock, because what they are going to do is they are going to model their relationships and their marriage on yours. They're going to take that script into their relationships and their marriage. Whether or not they like it. They might look at it and say, Mom and Dad were a mess. I don't want to be like them. But you better believe that same pattern of relationship is going to play out in theirs unless they work really hard against it. Okay? Because that's all they know. That is normal to them. And if you're not providing that example for them, you are damaging them. You're causing them a lot of damage. Now, there's a book that was written by you might be familiar with her, Lila Miller. It's called Primal Loss, and it's The Now Adult Children of Divorce Speak. And if you ever have any doubts, because I know this is kind of a popular thing to be thrown around in society nowadays, is that divorce doesn't hurt anybody. The children are fine, right? You don't have to worry about them. Well, this book actually goes to those children, right, and talks to them about it. Now, you can also go look up all the studies, right, of how this affects children negatively. If someone tells you it doesn't, they're honestly are not mistaken, okay? So if your marriage is in trouble, your job is to work on it together, right? That is your job. It's for yourself, it's for your children, it's to glorify God, right? It's for one another. It's for all of those things, okay? Now, last but not least, family time comes first. And I've kind of been hinting at this as we've kind of gone along tonight. But what we need to be doing is we need to be prioritizing family time. Okay, for our children to be in 12 different sports and 13 different extracurricular activities doesn't do any good for them. Right? Sure, they can be in things, that's great. Sports are good, clubs are good, those things are wonderful. But they need to recognize that family time comes first. And what that does is it models right order within the family. Because again, they're going to take that script with them, okay? Now, it builds intimacy and bonding within the family. It's going to keep siblings close with one another. It's going to keep a close relationship with you as the parents. And it also provides structure and routine for the family. The children have something to count on. They know that when I come home tonight, one of the first things that we do is we eat dinner together as a family. Then we pray, then we have game time, then we do whatever it is that we do. But they have structure and there's comfort and there's safety in that. It helps to build that secure attachment. Okay, so it's one of the most important things that we can do for them is provide that structure, provide these different rituals that I was talking about, the work, play, talk, pray, right? They need that. I mean, we as adults need that, right? We like our structure, we like our routine, we like to know what's going to be happening and when it's going to be happening. And our children need that even more than we do, okay? Now, it also teaches proper life balance and how to focus on and prioritize things in our life. If I'm doing the things that I should be as a father, for example, I'm leading the family in prayer, I'm raising them in the faith, I'm teaching them about God, I'm treating my wife with the dignity that she deserves, right, with the respect that she deserves, including in how I act and how I talk towards her. If I'm raising my children the right way, treating them with the dignity and worth that they have as being made in God's image and likeness, I'm providing them with what they need and how they can base their relationships. Because they are going to take that into their adulthood and they're going to recognize that God comes first, then my spouse, then my children, and then everything else, right? Including sports and extracurriculars and my job and whatever it might be. But those are my priorities, okay? God, spouse, children, and everything else can kind of fit in after that, right? And when you're scheduling your day, how much time do I have to work? How many hours can I spend in the office? That should always be based on this much time is going to be spent with God, this much time is going to be spent with my spouse, and then with my children. And whatever's left is what I can devote to work and extracurricular activities, right? Whatever's left. That's where that time will be spent. Okay, so just kind of as a summary and kind of a wrap-up of all of this, some of this information might be new, some of it might not be, but hopefully at the very least it serves as a reinforcement for the things that you are doing. Because the one thing I want to emphasize, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this today, is that your children need you, and the role you play in their life cannot be filled by anybody else. Okay, and God has graced you, blessed you with that role. It's not the result of, I got married and it was awful and we had children, right? But what it is that God decided to bless you with that child, right? And to bless you with that spouse. Okay. All right. Thank all of you for listening to me blab on tonight. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure being here, and hopefully this was helpful.